fantasy short stories. Beatrix Sallow and the Wine Cellar Caper, produced by Phoenix Star. "Hello, Mr. Teapot. How are you this afternoon?" Beatrix pulled the fine china down from the cabinet, standing on her tiptoes to do so. "Oh, I'm lovely. Thanks for asking," she responded to the silence of the inanimate object. "And how is your wife, Miss Sugarbowl?" Beatrix asked, retrieving the other piece of the set. I see," she replied stoically. "Thank you for telling me." The kitchen of Lord Griswold's mansion was empty save for Beatrix, and in fact the silence that permeated it traveled throughout the entirety of the enormous house. At one time it had made her anxious, but now she talked to the tea sets, which made the immediate loneliness a little more bearable. Beatrix had never liked other people much anyway, or at least that was what she told herself. "Not too hot for you, Mr. T?" she asked as she filled the wide white belly of the teapot with the floral brown of Earl Grey. "Oh, no, only one for me, Mrs. S. I shouldn't indulge," she said, placing one sparkling white sugar cube into the bottom of a thin porcelain cup. The tea steamed as she poured it over the sugar cube, the confectionery quickly melting away and disappearing entirely into the brew. "No, I haven't had any word from Lord Griswold in quite some time, Mr. Creamer." She paused as if listening to a response, dribbling the tiniest splash of milk into her tea. "You're right. It is a bit disconcerting." She sat down at the table, the white linen of the tablecloth brushing her stockinged legs. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. C." She nodded solemnly. "But Lord Griswold entrusted the care of his estate to me and only me. He trusts me." She took a long, loud sip. "If he didn't, why would he have left me here?" The tenor of her voice lost some of its confidence. "Alone." There was a long, tense silence. "I am very capable," she said with a giggle, patting the teapot lid. "Thank you for noticing." Beatrix set the cup of tea down and smothered the folds of her black skirt beneath her hands, hearing only the swaying tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. For whatever reason, she ended the conversation with the fine china there. There was no more awkward questions from Mr. C, no more fawning compliments from Mr. T, and certainly not a peep out of Mrs. S. Beatrix simply drank the pot of tea in the still quiet of the mansion. There was no loneliness in her expression, however, and from time to time she would hum a tune to herself or swing her feet under the table, her demeanor something like a child waiting for the return of a parent on an errand. When the tea was gone, she carefully cleaned up, washing out the serving dishes and then drying them meticulously until they practically sparkled with the effort. Then she slid the tea set back into the cabinet, placing it precisely where she had found it, as if it had never been used at all. "Time for more work," she said with a light sigh, tightening the strings of her apron at the small of her back. Beatrix skipped out into the foyer and inspected the intricate tile mosaic that made up the entryway to Lord Griswold's mansion of an estate. "This could use a good scrub," she proclaimed, her hands on her hips with determination. Beatrix procured a mop and a bucket, filling the thing to the brim with hot, soaping water. She struggled back to the entryway, some of the stuff slopping over the lip of the bucket and splashing at her feet. Beatrix said distastefully. "Too much work." She set the bucket down, and with a wave of her hand, the sudsy container of water was levitating in the air. "That's better," she said gleefully. Beatrix moved from one corner of the room to the next, sweeping the broom almost as if she were dancing with it. The tile beneath her feet sparkled and shined. She used the same magic to empty and return the bucket to its place with a twirl of a finger, wringing out the mop and setting it inside the broom closet. "What's next?" she asked the empty mansion. She nodded her head and began to walk up the grand staircase that led to the second floor. "A little dusting in the library sounds perfect. I might even read a book." She ended the thought with a hapless giggle. The double doors to the library always filled Beatrix with a sense of wonder. Their ornate carved shapes looked more like a painting than carpentry, and it was with a reverent hand that she pushed them open. One of her many tasks was checking each tome for book lice, and though it was a monotonous chore, it did allow her to get to know the selection of Lord Griswold's personal collection. Today, she started with the titles that began with E, having finished up with D the day before. The first book she pulled from the shelf was titled Eggcellent, The Chef's Love Affair with the Humble Egg. Intrigued, Beatrix flipped open the book and began to peruse its recipes. After her inspection revealed no sign of insect intruders, she snapped the book shut and ran her feather duster over it and returned it to the shelf. I'll have to try making that quiche, she said to herself. She moved methodically down the row this way, finding travel diaries, biographies of famous wizards, and even a field guide to exotic mushrooms. It was one of the less tedious tasks she had been assigned by Lord Griswold in her singular upkeep of his estate, and one she not so secretly looked forward to every day. Perhaps it was the interruption of her favorite task that led to the events that followed. Beatrix's focus and peace were shattered by a significant clamor from below. She thrust the book in her hand back onto the shelf and raced out of the library, pausing at the landing to the grand staircase. There was a prolonged silence, and then the ruckus came again. The simple black flats on her feet slapped against the stairs as she flew down them, careening toward the kitchen. Beatrix skated into the room, gripping the wash sink for support as she slid to a stop and listened once more, just to make sure. The noise was louder here, a chaotic mixture of chatter and roughhousing. Beatrix paused, her whole body tense with the act of listening. She took a steadying breath and approached the servants' stairwell that led down to the wine cellar. The racket pinged off the stone stairwell, bubbling up from below. Bandits, she whispered to herself. After Lord Griswold's rare collection of vintages, how did they get in? Carefully, she began her descent, one step at a time, her ears peaked to any noise or talk that might reveal more about the intruders. There was a loud crash and the sound of shattering glass, and Beatrix pressed herself into the wall as a gruff voice broke over the chaos.
Grub! Watch those damn clumsy hands of yours, damn it!
Sorry, sir, came a higher-pitched, almost wheezy response. Beatrix peered around the corner, her eyes adjusting slowly to the dim light of the cellar. A few torches had been lit, their flickering orange glow dancing shadows across the stone floor and walls. In the shadows moved odd shapes. These are the smallest bandits I've ever seen, she murmured as the intruders continued to argue amongst themselves. Gradually, her vision grew more precise. Beatrix realized that her newfound roommates were not actually human at all. The tallest of them, the one that had been referred to as Sir, could be nearly her height, she supposed, but all the rest would come up to her waist at best. And they're green, she said to herself, her eyes going wide. One of the bandits came dangerously close to her as he stuffed bottles of wine into a large sack. Beatrix studied him, calling to mind the many scientific guides she had perused in the Lord's library. The creature's short stature and algae-green skin were not enough to identify his species, but the large, almost luminous eyes, combined with blunted fingers that ended in sharp claws, gave him away. "Goblins!" she shrieked at full volume, and the thief closest to her startled with a loud yelp, the bag of wine he was holding splashing to the floor and spreading out in a purple pool.
"Who's there?"
called the gruff, tall one, stepping fully into the torchlight. Beatrix gripped the handle of her feather duster tightly in her right hand and moved out of the stairwell into the center of the room. "My name is Beatrix Sallow, and you are trespassing in Lord Griswold's wine cellar." The goblins around her began to snicker. What she now recognized as a hobgoblin leader let out the loudest guffaw of them all.
You're awful brave for a maid,
he said, orange eyes glinting at her as his fanged mouth opened in a grin.
But we can't have you following us, now can we?
The goblins surrounded them now, eager for whatever they assumed would happen next. Beatrix pulled on the handle of the feather duster and watched as the blade inside it was revealed, gleaming red in the light of the torches. The hobgoblin took a step back in surprise, his cat-like eyes blinking rapidly.
I said you're trespassing,
Beatrix hissed before leaping at the leader. The hobgoblin quickly drew his own weapon, a crude axe that met her blade midair, sending an aching vibration down Beatrix's arm. It did not deter her. She snarled and pushed forward again as the goblins around her recovered from their surprise and began to cheer for their leader.
Get her, sir!
Snark! 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 Chanted some others.
Your name,
she gritted her teeth together as their weapons caught,
is Snark.
Snark, the hobgoblin, gave a guttural laugh as he forced her backwards.
Your name is Beatrix.
Beatrix is a fine name, she snapped back.
Snark is a traditional hobgoblin name. I am named after my grandfather,
said Snark, brandishing his axe menacingly. Beatrix paused. Oh, that's very nice, actually.
Thank you?
This fighting is getting us nowhere, Beatrix sighed and shook her head.
Why?
Snark was cut off as Beatrix waved her blade, a blue glow now suffusing the metal. The hobgoblin's body went rigid. You're going to take me to your leader, she said authoritatively. Boss? Asked one of the hobgoblins in concern as he raced to Snark's side and began to tug on his coat.
There's no problem here, Grub. This nice lady wants to meet the boss.
That seems like a problem, if I'm honest, sir, Grub pointed out. Snark waved away the goblin, and Grub shuffled back to the small collection of goblins at Beatrix's back.
You try anything, lady, and we'll get ya, said one of them.
Beatrix turned and fixed the offending goblin in her sternest gaze. The creature squeaked in fear and ducked behind his compatriots. Snark turned and strode behind one of the large casks of golden ale that lined the back wall. Beatrix followed and let out a gasp as the crumbled-away wall behind it was revealed.
So that's how you got in, she whispered.
Wasn't so hard, Grub chimed. You really should tell your lord to reinforce his foundation.
Isn't up to code,
said another. Beatrix took this information with a grave nod. Grub skittered ahead, torch in his hand, leading the way down a crudely carved tunnel that Beatrix had to crouch to fit through. The air around her felt damp, and the loamy smell of dirt suffused the space.
How far does this go?
She asked, her voice muted by the confines of her surroundings.
Oh, it'll take us most of the afternoon,
answered one of the other goblins.
Name's Lou, by the way.
He held out one forest-green, gnarled hand. Beatrix shook Lou's hand vigorously.
Nice to meet you, she replied. I have to say that digging tunnels into cellars doesn't seem like the most efficient way to rob people.
You think this is our first heist, missus? Responded Lou with a wild cackle. We've broken into half the manors in this country alone.
Always through the cellar?
Lou shook his head.
No, don't be ridiculous. This was just the best option for this particular job. Would have gone off without a hitch. He raised his voice. If somebody hadn't made so much noise.
Grub snapped his head around and glared at Lou.
First time.
Lou jabbed his thumb in Grub's direction and shook his head at Beatrix as if in commiseration.
Ah,
Beatrix said knowingly. The odd group traveled in silence for a while, Beatrix's blade still glowing a subtle blue, maintaining her control over Snark. The tunnel began to widen slightly and slant upward toward the surface. Beatrix craned her gaze around the lumbering form of Snark and caught a glimpse of a light glowing beyond. As they neared it, the goblins around her began to grow agitated.
I really don't think the boss is gonna like this, she heard one whisper.
Especially coming back empty-handed,
said another.
Snark is in charge. He's gonna take the heat, not us.
Snark, for his part, seemed unmoved. In fact, the hobgoblin was humming happily to himself as they approached what Beatrix could only assume was the exit. A subtle heat radiated through the air now, and a distinct sulfur flavor to the atmosphere. Beatrix covered her nose with her hand. "Where on earth are we headed?" she asked.
You wanted to see the boss, so to the boss we go,
Snark said, his gravelly voice mixing oddly with the sing-song tone of his words. Beatrix covered her eyes with her other hand as she stepped out of the tunnel and into whatever awaited them. The light was not altogether that bright, to her surprise. It only seemed so in comparison to the dankness of the path that had led here. She blinked, her eyes more comfortable now as she began to look around. Beatrix and her green companions now stood in a large, cave-like structure. Massive stalagmites and stalactites dotted the cavern, covered in effervescent mushrooms that lit up the space like lanterns. The floor rippled with tiny rivulets of water streaming around their feet. A mist of unknown to her gas hovered in the air, the source of the sulfuric smell. "Where are we?" she asked, her mouth parted in awe.
"Home sweet home," answered Grub. "We're under the White Peak Mountain,"
Lou replied more informatively. "Really?" Beatrix asked, her eyes going wide with surprise. "We really traveled that far?"
"Time flies when you're walking through an endless tunnel of dirt,"
Lou snorted. "I don't think that's how that saying goes," replied Beatrix in all seriousness. Lou's creased face furrowed further in frustration. There was the sound of shifting rocks, and the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. Beatrix gripped her feather duster blade tightly in her fist, prepared for what was to come. A large shape loomed out of the inky blue light, uncoiling itself like a rope. "A dragon?" Beatrix stood her ground, watching as the goblins around her began to tremble visibly.
"The boss,"
whispered Lou as he ducked behind a stalagmite. The dragon's massive, scaled head glittered like 1,000 stars as it swung back and forth, its luminous red eyes searching. "Snark, where is the loot?" Snark, still unbothered, addressed the dragon.
We don't have any, boss. This maid here wanted to see you, so we...
Snark paused as the dragon lowered its head down to the hobgoblin's level and fixed him in a deep stare. "She's charmed you. Interesting."
What?
Snark was cut off as the dragon's tail appeared out of the shadows and smacked him full force in the chest. His body flew to the side, smashing into the rock and sending thousands of mushroom spores showering over him like snow. The hobgoblin slid down to the cavern floor with a groan. "Tell me," the dragon addressed Beatrix now, and she felt the full weight of its ancient magical gaze. "How did a powerful sorceress such as yourself end up as a simple maid for Lord Griswold of all people?" Beatrix released her hold on Snark, the glow of her blade dimming as she replied in total confidence, "Not even going to introduce yourself? I expected more manners from such a distinguished beast." The dragon cocked its head to one side in surprise. "My, we are cheeky," it said, and then gave a loud, rumbling laugh that broke off one of the stalactites, sending goblins scattering away as it smashed into the rock floor. "You may call me Malg," the dragon finally answered. "Mistress of the White Peak." "Honored to meet you." Beatrix gave a deep curtsy. "I am Beatrix Sallow." "Are you going to answer my query now, Beatrix Sallow?" The dragon lowered her head to the ground, staring up at Beatrix with a surprisingly docile, curious look in her red eyes. I lost a bet, Beatrix admitted with a light sigh.
You...
Malg arched her back, raising her head back into the air and looking down over the whole cavern.
You lost a bet.
Mm-hmm, Beatrix nodded. Lord Griswold is a powerful wizard, you see, and nearly a century ago he cleaned me out in a poker game.
A poker?
Malg seemed at a loss for words, and Beatrix rocked her small frame back and forth on her feet as she waited for a complete response.
How long have you been paying off this debt?
Oh, Beatrix's voice chimed lightly in the air. Coming up on a century. I'm nearly finished with my work for him. Malg blinked, her tail slithering around a stalagmite and gripping it tightly in a coil.
I see.
So I would appreciate it if you could hold off any further raids on his estate until I am gone from the premises. Otherwise, I may have to kill all of your minions, and I'll admit I've grown fond of them.
Aww,
she heard Lou squeak from his hiding place. The threat amused Malg.
When are you free of your contract?
Beatrix calculated something in her head. A month and 3 days. Malg's head disappeared into the shadows, a low, rumbling chuckle filling the air.
Very well, Beatrix Sallow. This has been very amusing, I have to say. For that alone, I will abide by your proposition.
Thank you. Beatrix gave another curtsy.
I have only one request.
Malg reappeared, her neck snaking towards Beatrix until they were nearly touching noses.
Come visit me when your debt to Griswold is paid.
Why, Mistress Malg? Beatrix asked, her eyebrows shooting up her forehead in surprise.
Goblins are not titillating company.
Beatrix giggled. I think that can be arranged.
Very well.
Malg slowly withdrew back into the shadows.
Escort her back to Lord Griswold's estate, boys, and see she gets there safely.
Lou and Grub reappeared quickly, Lou even going so far as to grab Beatrix's hand and pull her back toward the exit.
You heard the boss.
Beatrix glanced over her shoulder as they reached the tunnel's threshold and waved. There was a brief pause, and then the tip of Malg's tail waved back subtly in reply. While this story was originally written by one R.E. Levy, it was produced by Phoenix Star, the game studio of the indie developer Saltume. Recently, they have started a Patreon account which will produce high-quality content monthly, short stories, mainly light fantasy adventures, as well as other content like anime-style illustrations, music, audiobooks, and ultimately video games. At the moment, they are focusing on establishing a Patreon income to be used to further their future projects. You can find this story and others as rewards for their Patreon at patreon.com/Phoenix_star. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that story. Personally, I loved the lighthearted nature of it, and I hope you guys did too. As I was reading the beginning part of this, I felt kind of nostalgic. I realized I have not been bored in decades. And I don't just mean a little bored, I mean like truly nothing to do, out of my mind boredom. Whatever Beatrix was experiencing there, I haven't felt that since I was a kid back in the 80s and 90s. And it just got me thinking, I constantly have something in front of me, whether it be an audiobook in my ear, or I'm reading a story, or I'm scrolling YouTube shorts. You know, there's a million things for me to just put my attention on. And while I do take time for mental health and listening to my own thoughts, it's not the same as being bored. I can't actually remember what it was like. And it's kind of blowing my mind. And I'm sorry for going on this little rant on the side, but this story really got me wondering. And I think tomorrow at work, I might just turn everything off and see what happens. Anyway, I hope you guys liked this story. If you did, be sure to leave a thumbs up and a comment if you're on YouTube. Or if you're listening to the podcast version, just be sure to subscribe for more brand new short stories. I'm Chris Herron, and that's it for today's Tall Tale TV.